I'm sure people will join after, or they'll probably just watch the recording after too, especially if they're trying to finish. This isn't quite technical, so I understand. Okay, so let's get started then. Alrighty, so I tried to make it engaging, because this is really is a bite-sized overview of ethics, and it's quite a big topic on Twitter. There are a lot of people screaming for it, although Twitter is dying. So there's a number of books, there's a number of other things out there, and that's just a quick overview. But first, I will tell you why it is that I'm capable of giving this presentation. So my name is Cecilia. I'm a PhD student at Arizona State University. So if you're not familiar with states, it's in the US. I'm based in Phoenix. I'm also a GitHub campus expert. Though I am not representing them today, it's still a really wonderful organization to ensure that communities are coming together. I was a past intern at PayPal and Garmin. I predominantly do tools development for the tools teams, which is my favorite thing to do. I love getting immediate feedback from my users. But in the past, in my undergrad for software engineering, I did computer vision, I did semantic web. And so I have papers in both of those topics. I also have done scientific technology development in my master's. So researchers who are chemistry, physics, etc., they need tools and they are not often programmers, or they did not have the background in programming to do a good job with the technique they need. So it's often like rapid development, poor testing, etc. Today, though, I am working on hackathons and studying it. So I'm not here today to study you, but that is my PhD topic. Why you are here is why I am curious about it. Hackathons are the reason I stayed in my undergrad, and now I get the chance to see so many communities come up, digital, in person, you name it. It's a wonderful time to learn about it, and I hope that I can tell the research community all about people like you and why it's so good for us. Chances are you left the classroom because it wasn't doing enough for you, and that's why you're here. So that is my PhD. As for a quick fun fact about me, I can read about 3 to 4 books in a day if I'm given the time. I don't have time these days with a PhD, but I certainly try. So you are welcome to tell me about your favorite book because I've either read it or I will add it to my list. I do read mostly sci-fi fantasy, but I am trying to expand my horizons. And then in the picture, you'll see my cat. She's actually sleeping on my window right now. She may be kind of noisy if she decides she doesn't like me talking so much. Moving on, though, today we'll be talking about what even is bias, why should we care, bias then and now, and then recent headlines, and what does it all mean for you? So first, I'd like to engage the chat. What even is bias? Whether it's to you, whether it's you did a quick Google, whether it's you have no idea. I just want to see what people are aware of. We'll give a couple minutes for that. I know we don't have too many viewers, but I do want to give enough time for people to think about it at least. No thoughts, no comments on what bias could be. Or maybe you're biased against telling me what you think. I am not an expert, but I am trying to share what I have gathered. I'll give it another couple seconds, and then we'll jump into it. All right. So my favorite place to start for any definition is Merriam-Webster. Merriam's first definition is that it's an inclination of temperament or outlook, especially a personal and sometimes unreasoned judgment. You might see this as prejudice. You might have, when you first saw me, had some opinions about who I am and whether I'm good enough to give this presentation. Or you might have said, hey, someone who looks like me, which is really exciting if that was the case. But for the most part, you had initial opinions when you first came in. And the reality of that is that everybody is socialized by their current community. And what I mean by that is that everyone follows hidden rules in society based on the community that they live in that tells them how to interpret different people and how they look and how they act and how they are, really, how they develop. And so you might have to be self reflective and ask, what are your judgments? What are your perceptions? How might you initially react to someone walking down the street? At least here in the US, people look funny at people dressed differently. So that is one such example. but there is work from psychology and therapy that are often thinking about combating those things. So maybe your first immediate reaction, subconscious thought, is a judgment, but you might catch yourself and say, well, actually, I really like their hair, outfit, nails, etc. And that's a way to start fighting back about against those unconscious biases that tend to persist. And yes, search engines are biased based on past search terms. Cache is a great way to start farming that. But also because everything tracks your history, everything tracks your data, that is definitely one way to do it. So, as for how people kind of realize that they've been socialized, you might see it in people that don't fit in, people who have immigrated to your country, people who have moved cities, transplants, people who have left their home countries, even home cities. So here in the US, I can tell you from personal experience, the West Coast and East Coast is extremely different. Each have their pluses, each have their minuses. I am personally an East Coast kind of gal, even though I'm on the West Coast. Such is life, but I'm here. So that said, there are people who have more technical minded approaches to things and they want to know what's the science version of it. No disrespect to either party. I am happily in part of both. I like the technical. I also like the interpersonal, the general definition outside of technology. But it is a deviation of the expected value, a statistical estimate from the quantity it estimates. And it also can be a systematic error introduced into sampling or testing by selecting or encouraging one outcome or answer over the others. That is dense. There's a lot to that. So let me tell you about statistics from my field. In engineering education, we do social sciences. The more that you sample of a specific group may lead to bias or skew in your data. So if I were to sample in hackathons today versus the past, today I might, hopefully, because things have improved, notice more balanced participation in terms of gender. However, in the past, like way back in 2015, 2016, we might find that our demographics for hackathons are predominantly skewed toward men. If we focus on racial demographics, we might find it skewed toward white and Asian / Indian. And I'm merging those on purpose. That is not great to do, that you might find it skew in that direction, particularly representative of computer science and software engineering degrees, which have lower, at least based in the US, participation in terms of undergraduate students in terms of demographics. So that said, hackathons today are diversifying. There's also a number of STEM initiatives that have happened in K-12 spaces to broaden participation in engineering and science, technology, mathematics, trying to fix the leaky pipeline that happens where basically we have less women, less other non-dominant groups coming into these classrooms in collegiate settings. And I say non-dominant, and not to be politically correct or to be attacked by that, I say non-dominant, acknowledging that it does perpetuate a colonizer perspective. That said, there are many other ways to refer to people who are not part of the typical historically privileged and empowered individuals in our history. You might have heard URM, underrepresented minorities. You might hear underserved minorities. There are people with different perspectives and opinions on how one wishes to be referred to. I'm referring to non-dominant for the sake of this presentation, though I, again, am knowledgeable about this. And that's pulling from my background with engineering education. You might have your own way of referring to things like BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, people who are disabled, people first language, and a variety of other references, regardless of your personal use. Non-dominant is what I'm using for right now, just because it fits. But we also want to see like, okay, we're in a hackathon that's like talking about AI, machine learning, data science, computer vision, etc. And a lot of you are interested in these things. There are so many different types of categorizations of biases out there. I will be sharing this presentation later so that way you all can read these links that I've added as my citations or sources. Some are peer reviewed, some not so much. It is more to give context as to what's going on, not as end all be all fact. It's just to provide diverse insight as to what's going on in the world today. So there's systemic biases where maybe it's you're oversampling on participants, you're favoring social groups over others. Maybe you want to specifically focus on, say, a Hispanic population. So you will have a systemic bias if you are looking at a Hispanic neighborhood. Automation biases means that you're taking the AI's word of what decision you should make over just researching it yourself and verifying that is in fact the decision you should take. Selection biases kind of is a little bit similar to systemic selection, being that you're not randomizing what population you're sampling from or the data that you're sampling from, which actually can lead to overfitting and underfitting depending on how long or how short you train your models on. There's also reporting biases. So the link that I've given actually provides a different set of examples, but from the social sciences perspective, as we're interviewing and surveying people, reporting biases is actually through self-report data. If someone asks me my level of confidence in programming on a scale of 1 to 5, today I might say 4. Tomorrow I might say 2 if I have nonstop bugs. These things are subject to change, and humans themselves are unreliable. And so there's also the fact that I don't know personally if they would evaluate my confidence to be the reality, like I have the technological background to be confident about it. So that's another aspect. If you consider like someone self-reporting on their learning, can one learner effectively identify that they themselves are a good learner? So there's a lot of biases in that. There's also overgeneralization, where you might be looking at your conclusions of your data, of your model, and saying, because it's true here, it's applicable elsewhere. Which isn't always the case, because there are many other demographics or attributes that impact how something can be evaluated. And finally, you have, sorry, I skipped group attribution. That's kind of, again, like systemic and selection biases. And then implicit being all of your internal biases, those things that you find yourself subconsciously making judgments on, those split-second thoughts as you interpret someone, as you look at someone, etc. These get imbued into the things that we create, which is why we're talking about this today. So who cares? The reality is everyone should. You're here, therefore you care, right? Or you're curious about it and you want to start caring. But ideally, everyone should, especially those from dominant groups. So people who have power, people who have privilege, people who are in companies who develop products for others. And I want you to hone in on that for others part. So entrepreneurs, inventors, people in companies engaging in local, national, and or global capitalism. I said that on purpose. You also have programmers and developers. And what does this mean in summary? Anyone creating anything for anyone. And again, for anyone. That for is a big thing we should think about. And I'll talk more about why that's important later. But first, I want to go over history. I mean, present day, because this still exists and it still happens, which makes me quite sad, but that is the reality of what we live in. So we have exemplars of racial bias. So if we think about automated water faucets, the articles I linked to refer to someone who went to a conference and someone who went to DragonCon, where they are of darker skin and they were trying to wash their hands. And while their friends could use the water faucets that were automated, they couldn't, which is kind of wrong. You'd think that regardless of skin color, they should just be able to use automated water faucets. But the reality is that these water faucets were using IR sensors and they were not calibrated for those with dark skin. The same thing happened with Xbox Kinect sensors when it first came out. Darker skinned people were not able to be identified. You also have photography calibration of skin tones back in the 60s, where eventually they made a generic white woman, and that was how you calibrated your camera for all the settings that you needed, like ISO, etc. And then they came out with another generalized set of women, all named the same name, but of different skin tones to help with calibration. At that point, it ended up becoming a digital photography revolution, so it kind of fell to the side. But actually, the reason change happened was because furniture stores were complaining about not being able to have properly calibrated photos of their dark couches. That's kind of problematic. And then here in the US, you also have standardized testing, which is a way of excluding people with less privilege to access education. It is still used today, even though the standardized testing associations have acknowledged it has racist origins. So you'll notice, at least in the US, universities are starting to not use standardized testing as a way to enter the university, but it is a way to get financial aid. So still a problem. You also have gender bias. Until the 2000s, women weren't included in medical trials. Women were basically just considered men. And by doing trials on men, you got everybody, right? No, that is wrong, completely wrong. Fewer women are inventing still. So you also have less potential patents created by women, thus leading to less inventions from diverse perspectives. And to quote from one of the books that I'll mention later, the world is not designed for women. So this person and a number of other articles go on to mention about spacesuits, where they are not always made, they haven't made enough for women. They haven't made them buy to fit women. You have CPR mannequins. I don't know about you, but women have extra features to them that CPR mannequins do not have. You have military equipment, car crash dummies. They are made to the average male size, which that is to say, that is not the only issue. It is not just made for not women. It's also not made for men. In the case of fighter jets, they crafted the seat and cockpit for the average person. Men and women have different averages, first of all. Second of all, what happens if you're above average or below average? And that's exactly what happened. These fighter jets were still uncomfortable for people who were too tall, too short, too thin, too fat. They were not comfortable still. So it's not just a matter of women not being accommodated, it's also men. And now for today, there's a lot of headlines out there. We've seen things like Lensa that just came out, and even ChatGPT. So Lensa's terms and conditions allows them to collect more data, which depending on your preference on data privacy can be good or bad. And so Lensa, initially when it came out, was not really suited for people with dark skin. They found that they weren't getting satisfying pictures like their friends of lighter skinned. That said, with the more amount of people with darker skin submitting their pictures for Lensa, it actually improved the results because they were collecting the data to retrain their model. But if we come back to racial bias, we have a lot of issues. We have Amazon's AI hiring tool, which ended up not selecting women based on the resumes it was given and the choices it should have made. It still ended up not selecting women. We also have an instance where an upsampling model was, Obama's photo was submitted and he was upsampled to a white man. And while Obama is not as dark as other people, he is still not a white man. You also have the iPhone X when they started doing face unlocks. People of similar races that were not white were finding that other people could unlock their phone if they were on the same race. And the excuse at the time given was that their features were generic or that they were too similar and there weren't enough defining features, which is rude, first of all. Then you have Google, where their Google Photos auto-tagged African Americans as gorillas. We have Google autocompletion, which we talked about briefly in the chat. There's some nasty stuff in there, and there's a whole book on that too. I'm not going to mention it because I don't want it taken out of context, but there are some nasty autocompletes dealing with white supremacy and how Jewish people should be, etc. It was awful, still is. And then you also have to consider on Facebook whose hate speech is blocked and whose is being kept and said, it's fine. And then if you consider the US and facial recognition or any form of profiling, which is wrong, yeah, that's pretty bad because you have results where they're saying that people who are darker skinned are more aggressive, more likely to be angry, more likely to be a problem, which is inherently racist and wrong. That said, the positive side is that some of these companies are starting to make amends. You have the Google Pixel, which in the last 2 or 3 years is targeting darker skin bias. They're trying to make it that they take better photos of those with darker skin instead of excluding them. So call back to that, film photography and calibration. There's also call outs in the computer vision community where we're retiring Lena. For those who have done computer vision tutorials, you might have seen a picture of a woman with a wide-brimmed hat and a blanket covering her shoulders. It's not that nice of an image. It's a Playboy image that's quite risque. But Lena didn't know about this, and the computer vision community went ham using her everywhere. So there's a whole documentary on that, basically saying that the computer vision community is not using Lena anymore. To use someone's photo so broadly without their permission is wrong. And then you have ImageNet, which is most common for classification, segmentation, and other similar projects that their categorizations were apparently not good, quite rude, and perpetuated some biases of the researchers and then some. So ImageNet has undergone a number of data revisions, categorization revisions, and plenty others. So the most important meme of the day, you didn't stop to ask if you should. You should always ask if you should. Whether or not you can is a good question. And for scientists, it is a very important question. But so frequently do we see sci-fi movies never stopping to ask if they should. So with you doing your projects, as you continue whatever it is you'd like to do, if you continue in this field, stop and ask if you should. Because that's a healthy first question to ask. and ask, who is it impacting? And is it positively impacting someone or not? So what do? Everybody always says, make noise, demand better, do better. That's not helpful. That's very generic, overgeneralizing, if you will. Yeah, that's not enough. So you are an individual, I'm an individual, everybody here is an individual, but you're all working on projects. So think critically of the data sets that you download. Is it diverse or is it a perfect data set? Should your perfect data set model be used in the real world? You should also acknowledge the limitations of your work. Maybe it does not help people with disabilities, and you should outright call that out because people with disabilities might want to use it and not be able to, and go, well, it's not made for me. Well, of course not, because you didn't think of that. Which the way to address that is to talk to potential users, involve them in your work, ask them what they need, what they want, what their preferences are, which leads into being the shoulders of the future as those who have come before you. You are standing on the shoulders of those who have come before you. You are standing on the shoulders of Timnit Gebru, who is an AI ethics researcher who was at Google, got resignated. There's a whole thing on that. You're welcome to go Google it. But there are people who have called into question these things. So going back to all those inventions that aren't really that far away, actually, they're like a couple of years ago, within the last decade. Water faucet's still not working, Xbox Kinect sensor, digital photography. So people have made calls to say this is wrong. And some of these things have been not resolved, not fixed, but they are being addressed. And so to that, I say value your own lived experiences and leverage them. You as an individual have a number of experiences that you've gone through, that you've lived through, that you've dealt with, whether it's outside of your control or in your control. Like as a Hispanic, queer, and disabled woman, I have a lot of experiences that I've gone through that allow me to better understand and empathize with other people who have similar experiences. That's not to say, though, that I can resonate with a white man who's abled who has not had to deal with these things, and vice versa. You should not put yourself in someone else's shoes, but you should be empathetic. And sometimes empathy can be, wow, that really sucks. I'm so sorry that happened to you. I don't know anything of what you're going through, but it's pretty clear it sucks. So there's a number of ways to address it. And a lot of it is just education. Okay, but like, what can you actually do? Like, I've ranted enough. So collect your own data sets, being mindful of people's permissions, privacy, rights, etc. Involve your users, as I said. Make sure you talk to them, their wants, their needs, their preferences. Educate yourself on allyship. There are so many communities out there, so many books, tools even to evaluate whether your website is disability friendly. For those who are colorblind, who use screen readers, etc., they are out there, so use them. There's tutorials on them too. And consider also, what are top researchers talking about, like people in ethics. So again, I mentioned Timnit Gebru. She's one of the most common ones that I've seen on Twitter, because she's been extremely vocal on Twitter about ethics at Google and then got resignated. So there's a couple links to that. You might also reflect on historical biases. So just searching it, racial bias in tech, gender bias in tech. These are all great ways to start learning what's out there. How are these prejudices being perpetuated? You also might consider reading some books. So Invisible Women is one of those, where the fighter jet example, the crash test dummy, came from. You might also consider Algorithms of Oppression, which talks more about how search engines reinforce racism. It's a bit of a difficult book. There's some strong stuff, but it was a good read. I highly recommend. And then there's Atlas of AI, Power, Politics, and the Planetary Cost of Artificial Intelligence. There's just these 3 books, but there's quite a bit more out there. So I highly recommend seeking them out. And with that, I want to do a meta call out on me. I'm obviously biased in favor of educating others on the ethics behind their work. I want to call out inequities that persist due to the naive usage of models, data sets, and quote unquote perfect things. In teaching you about bias, I also ask that you spend time to sit with the information I told you, question yourself, and learn about it yourself. I don't want you taking on my biases. I want you to form your own. You're allowed to have conflicting opinions, and you may even believe multiple things as true, even if they're conflicting, which is cognitive dissonance. New word for you today, if you haven't heard of it. So maybe something really sucks, but it's really helpful. That's hard to deal with, to navigate. And so be okay with that. You will be like even ChatGPT, novel, new, everyone wants to use it, so many different use cases. I'm going to give you the example of a project that I got to interact with at a recent hackathon. And this is not meant to flame them in any way, but I thought it was an interesting thing that I think maybe ethics were not considered in the development of this project. They believed that people should have opposing viewpoints when they were looking at specific articles. So ChatGPT would generate an opposing article. So maybe something like AI is the bane of our existence and going to destroy the world. An article would be generated saying AI is the solution to the future. There's a lot of questions there. And I ask you to think about it. What makes you uncomfortable about it? Why are you uncomfortable? The short version is question everything. What are your socialized biases? How do they manifest? And so with that, that's pretty much it. So what did you think? I am happy to take your questions, and I appreciate that you spent the time to listen. Hope you learned something and have something to take away, and you're welcome to reach out to me for talks, grad school advice, resources, and plenty others.
Just a question.
Sure.
So just from a business perspective, why should businesses be incentivized to take on the extra costs of developing these great features, but for a very small subset of their users?
That's a really good question. One that I've actually had a conversation with my partner about a lot. We've gotten into fights about it even. So when you consider the capitalist perspective, yes, you probably don't want to develop for the not majority. But when you also consider the way that the world is today and the amount of protests and callouts and cancellations of people and companies and products, you also have to think about your end line if you want to think about it from capitalist or business perspective. How is that going to impact your company when you realize you've purposely excluded people and you're getting called out on it? See Pillow, for example. It's like it's a pillow company and they got canceled. So that's a lack of revenue because their CEO was terrible. But you also might consider that in today's world, there are a growing number of people with disabilities. There are a growing number of people who need access to things. And when you think about the potential benefit of, hey, you now have access to a brand new community that you get more revenue from, but also your image as a company might benefit as well, making yourself more reputable. Today's society is, I think, moving toward a more empathetic one, especially with all of the horrible acts of violence that continue to persist in today's society, namely the most recent stuff that's happened in the US. And that's not to say that this is happening everywhere, but the US is most predominant in issues that I'm aware of because I'm based in the US. I think it's really just figuring out, do you want to be a company that's terrible and continuing to perpetuate issues, or do you want to be on the forefront of addressing them and being known for tackling these things rather than doing it as an afterthought? And that really, the extra cost is you bring extra people in during product creation, ideation, talking to them and saying like, can you test this? Can you use this? Quality assurance is actually one of the things that is most commonly skipped in a project development pipeline. And it really shouldn't be, because that's how you get to realize, hey, we totally missed features that could have helped the disabled community. And so with COVID, that expedited that issue. Because now we needed subtitles on Zoom calls. We needed Zoom. We needed a vast improvement in our like mobile communication, virtual conferencing, et cetera. And things suck right now. So there's something to pull from Black feminism, actually, and you don't have to like agree with it or anything. But with Black feminism, the theory is that by helping the lowest, most marginalized group, you benefit everyone on the way up. So if you were to characterize and hierarchically categorize people and their races and disabilities on all the things, the person on the lowest of the totem pole being benefited helps everyone else going all the way up. Bit rambly, but the gist. I don't think YouTube channel is or YouTube chat is coming through.
I also have a question, actually. Have there been or are there like standard procedures to ensure that these models are as unbiased as possible, or is it mainly just relying on like the data sets at this moment?
That's probably not a question for me. I can speculate, which is to say there are probably not standard processes out there because people are talking about it now, screaming about it now. AI researchers, ethics researchers are the ones probably asking for that or describing what it could look like to do that. That said, with the way data sets were curated early on and how they're curated now, I would say is vastly different. Back when I was doing computer vision, that's when people started talking about how these perfect data sets, these perfect models couldn't be used in the real world. So if you think about automated cars, if you have a perfect data set that's never seen a deer in the road, how do you handle a deer in the road? So the thing is, then you have the question of how do you collect a deer in the road data? That's not as common as you might think, and it also is a very dangerous thing to collect. So that's a not bias related one, but still an example of it's sometimes difficult to collect data like that. And people are still trying to figure it out. But there are ethical ways to go about it, whether it's respecting the people that you're talking to. So pulling from the social sciences and the research that I do, there are ways that we are trying to respect the community through qualitative and quantitative data collection. We only collect what we need for the project. We don't collect anything else. So maybe I'm asking a question about how people are learning, and I want to understand it from the perspective of demographics. So I want to understand, are people of color having learning experiences different than people who are of dominant groups, et cetera. Then I would need to collect demographics. But I also have to ask myself, do I need whether someone is queer? Do I need whether someone's socioeconomic status? And so you have to ask yourself, what are you willing to ask for? And also, how are you going to make sure that it's used well? And you also then have to ask, am I making this person uncomfortable? Because when you ask people about their socioeconomic status, people will not give it if they are ashamed of it. And you have to respect that they're likely not going to give it to you. So that's something to navigate or something to think about as well. And that collecting data is in itself a difficult, but something that needs ethics behind it process.
Yeah, this weekend we do a lot.
Given the existing bias in data sets, what do you think is the ethics behind excluding certain data sets? How do we prevent AI from allowing a very vocal biased opinion to be disproportionately represented as compared to what might be a silent majority opinion? That is a dense set of questions. Let's start from the beginning and work our way through it. So there's existing biases in the data sets. Yes. And if it's hard to mitigate those, as I mentioned. Like there are some things where you just can't get the data, whether out of respect for populations or individuals, or it's really hard and dangerous. The ethics behind excluding certain data sets. I think there's something that we can draw on history from in that respect, that there are renaming of buildings in the US of Confederate individuals to not remove them from history, but remove them from being a public face. We still teach history though. So you might think history should be taught in order to avoid repeating history, not that the human race has really followed that. So you might, I would think about it from that perspective, that we should exclude certain data sets, but we shouldn't exclude it without reason or without understanding why they're being excluded, and maybe perhaps working to develop one that supersedes that truly does represent what an ideal data set should look like. I think my internet cut out briefly. I think I'm back. And then as for how do we prevent AI from allowing a very vocal biased opinion versus disproportionately represented as compared to what might be a silent majority opinion? How do you know it's a silent majority opinion? Without collecting data on that, we would be making assumptions, which, to quote a professor of mine, to assume is to make an ass out of you and me. So as for preventing AI being vocal, I mean, we see it in the many times that people have created trained chatbots and they've gone into the deep dark end because of what's going on and how toxic chats can be. So they've often been cut, canceled, deleted, quieted, retrained again. At the moment, I don't think there's prevention. The internet is open access. There's so many ways that you could create something, that someone could create something, again, naivety, or even on purpose. There are people with malicious intent, even with like the deep fake streamer. I don't remember their name, but they had to come out with a public apology, how they got sucked in without realizing it, etc. These things are just accessible. So it's a matter of how are you questioning yourself. From YouTube, what is the most common bias you see in tech that could easily be avoided? That's a hard one. I think a lot of biases could be avoided if we actually did quality assurance and actually involved people from different communities in testing, in ideation. I don't have an answer for that one. I'm going to stop sharing now in the hopes that my internet cooperates and my computer cooperates. Doesn't like Zoom today. And I know that we're at time. So any last questions? My computer has frozen, so if anything's coming through chat, I can't read it. Anything on your side?
There's a follow-up. What should the first steps be to resolving the issue then?
The first steps to resolving. For an individual like myself or yourself or anyone here, education is the first start. Critically questioning what you intake. Because we are the future generation. We are the ones who are going to be in industry or in research. Carrying those critical questions forward into the things that we create perpetuates what we would like to see happen. I mean, again, the younger generation is out on the streets. They're on the internet. They're in newsrooms reporting. Again, taking from the US, there are a number of students who have been through shootings, school shootings, and they are making calls to action. So putting yourself out there in whatever way you are capable of is one way to add to the communication that's already happening. You, as you educate yourself, as you pick what you're going to do for your future, or you continue in your path for your future. For example, I study hackathons. While I believe they're great and good and wonderful, there's always room for improvement. There are hackathons that are naively created, such as one that may be focused on disability accessibility, but has no education involved in it. That's kind of naive and almost harmful, because now you're saying, let's just make accessibility tools. But do they have any insight from people who are disabled, who have specific needs that aren't being met by current technologies, which I guarantee you there's quite a bit. So listening to others, being open-minded,